Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, and welcome to my next video chatting about the albums of Peter Hammill, where today we're going to be talking about the late 80s, specifically with two albums. First one, In a Foreign Town from 1988, and the second one, Out of Water, which is technically from 1990, but I think we can all agree conceptually it fits with the late 80s stuff. You can kind of group, those four albums, Skin, and Close as This, In a Foreign Town, and Out of Water. It kind of represents a specific era in his career, so it's only fair that I should put this one in the video and call it the late 80s. It's also relevant to put these two in the same video because just recently, us lucky Hammill fans were treated to this lovely little package, which is In a Foreign Town and Out of Water re-recorded in 2023. Now, long story short, the reason he did this, it has to do with licensing, I believe. Hamill's right now he's at a stage where he wants to make sure that the material is out there and available in the market. And because the licensing for these two albums was kind of in question, it was actually less of a headache to just re-record the albums in their entirety than it was to, kind of figure out how he might reissue the original recording. So it's very interesting. It's we obviously this particular era is noted for the 80s production values. So when this came out, I wasn't sure if we were going to get like a complete re-recording or if it's going to be, these songs completely re-envisioned. But for the most part, he does stay true to the originals, which I do respect because, it's an era in his catalog, right? This is the 80s era. This is where Hammill is at his most 80s. So there are a few differences on some of the songs. We'll talk a little bit more about this as I get towards the end of the video, but yeah, this is a very cool package. If you're a Hammill fan and you're open to this particular era, I definitely recommend picking this up because it's a very cool listen for sure. I would consider, for the most part, the versions on this are the definitive versions because they stay kind of true to that 80s sound to a certain extent, but the production's loosened up a little bit. But like I said, we'll talk more about that as we go on. So let's talk about In a Foreign Town. This is a fun one to talk about because this is, I don't know, I don't want to say that this is like a maligned album in his catalog, but it certainly stands out. Like I said, this is all the proggy 70s artists had that challenge in the 80s, and eventually like they made what we would consider the 80s album. And in Hammill's case, this is very much the 80s album. The production is very dated. Nobody could deny that. It sounds very much like 1988. But I don't think that deters from the songs actually. And I wasn't born yet, so I didn't spend any period of my life where that sound and music was oversaturated at all. So it sounds different from most of his albums, but I think it's still very, very good. Lyrically, it's very notable in that he's kind of going into the back into the social and political commentary, which is kind of rare in Hamill's case. This is the first time he really dives into that since like the late 70s with your Future Now, PH7 kind of stuff. So that makes it stand out. Musically and lyrically, it is a unique moment in the catalog. It's kind of funny coming after And Close as This. Again, it's a seems like another 180-degree turn. Like he's going in a completely different direction. But if the way I think of this as being more of the natural follow up to Skin, really. And with Skin, we had some of those 80s production elements like the programmed music and the sequencing. It pops up a couple of times. There's a few moments on Skin where it's really prevalent, whereas on this album it dominates it massively. We also have the drum machine is a lot bigger sounding than the one he was using on like PH7 or Black Box and Future Now, that era. This is a very 80s drummer. The snare is about the size of an elephant, and it every time that snare strike hits, it hits you right in the face. Every time I point over there, that's where my sound stage is. So if I listen to the album, that's where that explosive elephant snare comes flying at you. But yeah, I mean, I feel there's probably a lot of fans that would consider this their least favorite. I don't know, maybe I'm out of line. He's made better albums than this, but he's made worse albums than this as well. So yeah, on the whole, I like all of Hamill's albums. Let's be real. I'm a major fan, but This isn't my least favorite, and it never has been. I've always had time for this, even in spite of the production values and that. But yeah, we'll just kind of dive into the tracks. Actually, we'll make a quick note on the album cover because I think it's a great cover as well. You know, nobody at the actual poolside, but then we get Hamill's reflection and his daughter. There's actually a CD reissue which I do not have, obviously, that came about after his second daughter was born. So you actually have two little girls in the in the reflection of the water, which I think is kind of a cool way to update the cover. But yeah, let's dive into the tracks then, shall we? So it opens with Hemlock. This is kind of back into that political stance. Well, I shouldn't say stance. He's discussing politics in this song. I think it really, for the most part, deals with I guess the helplessness that a lot of us kind of feel as all these crazy things in the world are going around us, and like what can we do? It's a hemlock world, and we just gotta swallow hard on the bitter taste, and off you go. Musically, it's quite interesting. It's very dark. It doesn't, that's another thing I should say with this. And even though the production is very 80s, I feel there's less commercial inclinations on here than there was on Skin, which is kind of interesting and possibly controversial. But the opening for Hemlock is fantastic. That really dark synth drone that comes in. It's very, there's a very immediate sense of dread and ominous. It's got an ominous quality to it. And then of course Hamill's voice comes up, here it comes up on the screen, and it's all very intense. And then it kind of winds its way into kind of a slower paced and very heavy shuffle. But yeah, it's great. We get the only guest contributor on this track. Stuart Gordon does play some nice violin, that da 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 dun 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 dun, which sounds really really good. And like I said, it's weird. He's the only guest contributor, and even though Hamill's in solo mode, the use of the programming and the synthesizer is kind of it creates a band. It's got the sound of a band album. Like I said, there's big drums, there's big keyboards, there's big everything, but it is apart from the one guest contributor Stuart Gordon on the first track, it is a solo album. But yeah, I'm a big fan of Hemlock. I think it's a great opener. It's dark. It's very Hammillian, and yeah, it's a good song. There's live versions of this, but I've never heard any of them. I forget which live album it is, but if there's anyone's got like a recording on YouTube or something like that, I'd love to hear Hamill doing Hemlock live, because it's not one that's likely going to come back in the set list, I wouldn't think. Moving on to the next song, we get Invisible Ink. This one's a little bit more poppy. We get some of those cool jangly guitars, the single line guitar bits that pop in and out. And this is a great song. It almost seems like he's describing how the average music listener might describe Hammill himself. His work. I mean, it is very esoteric to the casual listener. You put it on, it's like, why is he yelling? Why is it so intense? Why is it this? Why is it that? Which I always thought was kind of funny. Again, just that murmur of esoteric. Perfectly sums up Hammill as an artist as on the whole, which I think is really great. But I definitely like it. There's another case where the snare is like right up in your face and very intense. But there you go. Good track. Moving on to the third song, track 3 is Sci Finance Revisited. Now, before I heard this album, of course, I saw the track listing, and I was always super excited to hear what Sci Finance would sound like in 1988. And I must admit, I was a little bit let down. I much prefer the original version from Vital, the Van der Graaf version. This is, definitely, again, it's in that, if there is a commercial inclination, it's probably in Sci Finance. Lyrically, it's perfectly relevant for the time. We're in, again, late 80s. This is like the peak of that kind of yuppie era and that corporate culture and all that. And it's even though the song, was mostly written in, late 70s, it really applies to the era that this came out. But the song is dramatically rearranged. You can identify all the parts from the original version, but it just seems very watered down, and it's very compacted, and it's even like the weird time signature part, that dun 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 dun, you almost kind of miss it. It's played, but the way that the drum pattern kind of goes around it, it doesn't really highlight the accents the way that Guy Evans does in Vital. which is a shame. And I think the the vital version is much more murky and mysterious and kind of unpredictable, whereas this is the straight pop version. Lyrically, it was rearranged a little bit. The lyrics are a little bit different, and yeah, not one of my favorites on the album. And when we got the re-recorded version, I was really excited. Like, wow, there's gonna be a third version of Sci Finance, and he basically just does the '88 version again for the most part. So, not a favorite, but it's okay. Moving on to track four, we get This Book. This is actually a cover, interestingly enough. I'm not familiar with the artist. He was a Spanish artist, and Hammill did have a hand in writing the lyrics. I think he wrote the lyrics and they're translated into Spanish or something like that. I've never heard the original version, but version on this one, it's okay. It's kind of like I wouldn't call it a power ballad, but it does have that. There's a longingness to it. And I think it kind of changes the theme up a little bit. This is more of like one of those life songs, moving on to the next chapter. This book has ended and off into the wild unknown sort of thing. But it's okay. Again, not one of my favorite tracks on the album. I think there's a real nice contrast there. I really like the uh, shouting at the thunder section. That's kind of nice and intense. And the newly recorded version actually I think is much better. It really did, particularly like the ending section. I think is much more um, dark and mysterious and more typically Hammillian than the original version. But yeah, it's okay. The first side wraps up with Time to Burn. This is far and away the classic of the album. This has been a regular in the live sets ever since, really, and it's one of the best songs on the album, I would argue. Um, very very dark. Well, I don't know if dark is the right word. It's melodramatic, and it deals with it's kind of a tribute to Tony Stratton Smith, of course, who was the head of Charisma Records back in the late '60s and during the '70s. And without Tony Stratton Smith, we probably never would have gotten any Van der Graaf Generator. There'd be no Peter Hammill solo albums. Like, he is a key element in Hamill's story, and he had passed away prior to the recording of this album. And Time to Burn, I believe, is his kind of tribute to Strat. And it's really good. It's also Hamill's mentioned that it's the first time that he kind of dove into orchestral arrangements. It's not a real orchestra, but the arrangement, the orchestra is really really good. And yeah, it's a very emotional, very potent, powerful piece. This is one where the '80s production, I really don't mind. I really don't mind it at all. I think it's because the quality of the songwriting transcends that '80s production. You almost don't even notice it, even though it's got the big drums and all that stuff. But definitely the classic of the album for sure. We flip the record over. There's Hammill in the theater, and we get the first song on side two, which is Auto. I don't know if this is a guilty pleasure song, but I've always loved this. It's so not Hammill. It's from what I can tell, it's literally a song about the love of driving and just getting in your car and driving. And it's got a really really great high energy to it. There's a lot of cheesy sounds in it, but again, I do not mind that at all. Like the horn patches that come in, that I think it's great. And it's high energy, it's fun, and yeah, what's wrong with Peter Hammill having a little bit of fun now and again. I feel this isn't typically. I think a lot of Hammill fans probably think of this as a bit of a throwaway track, but like I said, I've always enjoyed the energy. And the new version on the 2023 version is just fantastic. If only for the fact that we have the modern older Peter Hammill singing "Get Back in the Motor." It's great. It's great. I've always been a fan. So yeah, Auto is a favorite song of mine. I get the idea that this is kind of the experimental track where he's messing with sequences and kind of arriving at the composition rather than writing it out and jotting it down. But what do I know? I wasn't there. Great song, Auto. The next song, we get Vote Brand X. This is kind of like a recap of the Hemlock theme, although it's probably more specifically directed towards politicians. Again, very relevant in this day and age, I would think. Really like the bass line on this. You can tell like that's definitely like a sequence bass line. It's kind of got that slap thing. It's almost like the same patch that the Seinfeld themes ended up using a year or two later. But it is really good. It's got kind of a slow and brooding groove. It's a great menace to it, and yeah, Vote Brand X. Um, Great track. More relevant today than it was back in 1988, which again, another reason why it's great that we have a version of it that came out in 2023. Moving on, we get Sun City Nightlife. This is probably, as far as vocal performances go, this is probably his best on the album. Like, possibly the best of the 80s. I think I said that there was another track that I mentioned, or maybe I was just talking about "And Close as This," but the Sun City Nightlife vocal is absolutely visceral. It's very intense. He's just wailing at the, he's at the top of his game. Um, Obviously talking about Sun City and apartheid in South Africa, so it certainly fits the kind of social theme of the album. I like the contrast between like the slow, kind of heavy verses and then the upbeat, super, the danceable chorus, which I think is really cool. Um, on the new version, this is the only case. Now, obviously, we're dealing with, there's well over 30 years of time passed between when, the original album came out and the Hammill did the 2023 versions. This is the only case where I feel the Hamill's voice does kind of struggle to match that intensity that he did, back then. But again, he's like late 30s, maybe early 40s around here. So, obviously the voice is going to be quite a bit different. But yeah, Sun City Nightlife is another great track on here. Kind of interesting to where there's a quote from a motorbike in Africa, which is kind of cool. It's kind of a cool link to the future now. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I swear he sings "Biko because Biko," which of course is the Peter Gabriel lyric from the song "Biko." And Hammill and Gabriel have always been. I've gotten the idea that they're kind of buds. They've always been friends, going way back to the Genesis Van der Graaf days, back when Genesis opened for Van der Graaf Generator, if you can believe that. Um, and yeah, if he says Biko because Biko, that makes a lot of sense because again, they've always had a relationship, and it certainly ties in with the theme on the song. But that's kind of cool. We move on to the penultimate track on the vinyl, which is "The Play's the Thing." Now, obviously, Hamill's a very wordy artist, so it's only natural that he writes a song that's a tribute to Shakespeare. I think this song is a really nice kind of breath of fresh air in the album. The tone really does change a lot. This is Hamill in kind of solo piano mode, so the big drums are gone, like the sequencing is for the most part gone, and it's a really powerful track. It's one that I tend to forget about, and then put the album on, and it's like, oh yeah, I forgot. That's a really good song. There's a spoken word interlude, which I think is really cool, where he quotes Hamlet, which is neat. And yeah, a classic bit of Hamill. Probably, I'm surprised this one hasn't gotten played more because it does feel like it's a classic bit of Hamill, like I said. And then the vinyl ends with "Undercover Names," which is probably the most high energy track on the album. There was some comment that I saw on YouTube or some forum somewhere, and they said that it reminds them of the music that's on the 6 o'clock news or whatever, and I've never been able to get that out of my head. I apologize for anyone that is now gonna, that I've passed that on to you, so my apologies there. Um, but it is a good song. This is arguing, in a very 80s album, this might be the most 80s track, and it is very upbeat, very high energy. The arrangement is really cool. There's a lot of intricate things kind of going on there between like some of the melodic percussion, and there's that orchestral stuff is happening as well, which is really cool. And this is kind of like more of a traditional Hamill song dealing with consciousness and identity and that whole thing, which is really the only one on this album that does that, I think. But yeah, it's cool. I always thought it was a weird way to end the album, though. It's not very Hamillian to end on something that's so upbeat and fun. Um, but however, when I got the new version from 2023, it does include two additional songs, which kind of round the album out quite nicely, which are "Smile." This is another cover that's on the album. This, I believe, is a German artist, and Hamill didn't write the lyrics to this, but he did translate it. And I would love to hear the original version, because I think the CD that came out in 1988 did include "Smile" and the final track. I've never heard that. It's not available on YouTube, and now that this version of the album is out, this is the only one that you can get on Spotify. So, yeah, so somebody send me a link if you know where I can listen to the original 1988, or not the original, the 1988 version of "Smile." But it's a really fun track, actually. I like that. It starts with that, kind of slide guitar, and again, it's Hamill in that playful mood, which it's fairly unique to In a Foreign Town, um, or it's most noticeable on In a Foreign Town. And then the album proper winds up with a reprise of Time to Burn, just totally instrumentally. And like I said, when I had the original vinyl, I always thought, ending it on Undercover Names was kind of an odd choice, but being able to listen to the full version of the album that finishes with the instrumental Time to Burn is much more classic Hamill. It brings us back to that kind of darkness and that I think the song's a lot darker without the vocals. Interestingly enough, like, without the lyrics, but it rounds the album out really really nicely, and it finishes correctly, and it finishes in more of a Hamill way. So yeah, there's In a Foreign Town. Not much of a review, just me rambling about it, which is kind of what I do. But yeah, it's a better album than people give it credit for. I've always been one to stand up for In a Foreign Town because it's unique, it's different, and it's just cool hearing Hammill in the '80s. Some artists they struck gold in the '80s like Genesis, and then other artists kind of fell apart when the '80s thing came around. But I mean, Hammill is an artist with such vitality. He doesn't make weak albums; he just makes different albums, and it's just plain interesting that we've got a Hammill album that is '80s. It is the '80s album, and it should be respected. So listen to it, enjoy it, appreciate it, etc. So before this video gets too long, we'll talk about Out of Water. This is the album that was released the year I was born. I was born later in the year, so I think it's closest to the moment of my of the beginning of my existence. It's the album that was released closest to my birthday, so that's still cool. And this is we see him. He's still kind of got one foot in the whole overproduced '80s sequencer programmed music, but he's got another foot firmly out in new ground, and you can really see him reaching to find out how he's gonna move on from that kind of stiff recording, that stiff production style. And as such, it's a very interesting album. I think it's more of a transitional album than anything else. I get the idea that a lot of Hamill fans rate this very very highly, and they should, because there are some classic tracks on it. I think it probably is a step above In a Foreign Town, but only just. They're both still very good albums. He's still very much largely in like solo recording mode, although there are a few guest contributors. I know John Ellis plays guitar on at least one track. David Jaxon comes back as well, first time since Skin. And Mozart, Nick Potter from early Vandergraaf days is there, and of course we've got some violin too. But the guest contributors are sporadic. It is still in essence, very much a Hamill solo mode kind of album, and yeah, much more diverse and much more exploratory than In a Foreign Town, I think. Whereas In a Foreign Town, he's kind of really focused on, honing in a particular style. This one, he's searching for styles. And it very much informs, where things would go throughout the '90s, and as such, it is good. This also marks the last time I have this is the first time my only copy is on CD. I know this was released on vinyl, but I have not yet come across it. I'd love to have it on vinyl, because that's the correct way to have albums. I shouldn't say that. I've got like hundreds of CDs over there. Anyways, it's all valid. But yeah, this is a good album. The cover is by John Ellis from K Group fame, of course, and the cover's kind of weird. I feel the cover doesn't it's a good cover, like it is objectively like a nice thing to look at, but I'm not sure how well it reflects the music. But again, what do I know? Yeah, we'll talk about the tracks. So opens with Evidently Goldfish. This is a great musing on consciousness as well, and just kind of the circular experience that we tend to live in our day-to-day lives. And it's a classic Hamill topic. I think Hamill said somewhere that this is a much older song. Like I think the original genesis of the song goes all the way back to the '60s, but this version is very much still in the '80s mode. This is one of the tracks that sounds, like it would sit comfortably amongst the tracks on In a Foreign Town. Still has that kind of stiff, the stiff drum parts and whatnot, and the keyboard choices are still pretty 80s, but it's a great song. I've always been hugely fond of it. I love the Ebo guitar intro, and the kind of the percussion and whatnot. The new version on 2023, the intro is much more menacing and much darker and much more brooding and scary and whatnot. So I think that the new version is a little bit ahead of this one, but yeah, I've always been fond of it. A fun song to open the album. We move on to Not the Man, and this is interesting because, again, we can almost see him taking one of those steps away from the production style of In a Foreign Town, while, he's still got that other foot that's still firmly in that zone. Because we have the kind of, stiff, clunky percussion, but the jangly guitar chords that go on and give it a more organic feel, and I think that certainly benefits the track. Pretty poppy song, really. Again, he's in that theme of identity in this case. Talking about the differences between your current self and your past self and your future self. And I love the line, "If I'm not the man I was, then who was he? Then who is me?" I can't dump the lyrics specifically in my head, but they're very good, and it is a good track. We move on to track 3, "No Moon in the Water." This is very much the experimental one on the album where, he's just messing around in the studio and putting all kinds of weird sequences together, and, eventually he ends up with a song. And it's a really good one. It's one of my favorites on the album, I would say. The way that the sequencers work are good. It's kind of mad the way that they all kind of shift and overlap with one another, and it creates a very unique atmosphere, something that only Peter Hammill would be able to come up with. And lyrically, I think it seems to be focusing on a Zen moment, where you can remove the ego and just appreciate a nice setting, like on a lake with a moon and in the sky or whatever. I'm not sure specifically what the setting is supposed to be, but I think it has to do with removing your ego and being present and naked to the moment, which very, very cool Hammillian theme, and it's a good song. We move on to track 4. This would be the final track on the first side with "Our Oyster." This is a classic Hammill piano ballad. Kind of almost harkening back to "And Close As This" style, but there's a little bit more of an arrangement there. Gets very, very intense as it builds. There's certain repeating themes, and it does have quite a nice climax to it. Lyrically, we're kind of going back into that social commentary, specifically with it kind of deals with the difference between the core gist of an event versus how that event is then spun and interpreted and spewed back out by the media. And this it uses a very specific example. I was talking about the Tiananmen Square massacre in this case, and again, even though the topical element of this song is dated, the concept behind it is again more relevant now than ever. The differences between the gist of an event and how it's reported in the news, and with social media and the way that things have gone in the world today, it has become hyper relevant, I would say. So yeah, very, very good song, very very on the nose, and very a good observation made by the Peter Hammill. And then if we had vinyl, we would flip the side, and we would get "Something About Isabel's Dance." Probably a contender for my favorite song on the album. This is the first time we're back with just a plain acoustic guitar. It's been a long time since there's just been a simple Hammill acoustic guitar song. Like, I think the last one where the acoustic is really obvious, I would say, is probably "Comfortable" from Patience, but that's a band track. So you go back a little bit further back, and it's maybe something like Ophelia from Sitting Targets. But this is very unique. It is just a classic Hammill guitar song, but it's very spacious and very jazzy. Stuart Gordon on violin does an absolutely amazing rendition of an amazing set of solos to kind of articulate and add to the piece, and it really is something special. I love the lyrics too. He's speaking in third person as someone who's observing these actions in a bar, in Tijuana, to get specific. But he's observing this girl's dance, and the song kind of discusses the difference between, the tourist trap, like when you go to an exotic country and you always have that the touristy version of what that country's culture is all about, but then you have the real version. And in this song, it talks about how you know if you're there at the right time and the right people are there, Isabel will dance the dance for real, and it'll be something that has substance and is real and is genuine, unlike the version that you would get if you're on the cruise ship and you walk up and, hey, look at this, the person dancing, isn't that cute? So great concept, great use of storytelling. I love the fact that it's in the third person, brilliantly performed, and it's probably my favorite on the album, I would say. Notable with the new version, the new recordings of this, Isabel's dance. It includes another section, which is apparently there's a Charlie Mingus song called Isabel's Table Dance, which kind of obviously that's where a lot of the lyrical bits kind of come from. But they add that section. I guess that's something that him and Stuart Gordon would do live. And that's the one moment on the new versions where I'm not sure if I'm totally sold on it. It's a beautiful tribute to Stuart Gordon, who of course has passed away, but I'm still so attached to the original version. And the original version still just sounds so good because it doesn't have that production. It's just Hamill's acoustic, Stewart's violin, and that single take on vocals. And yeah, the original version is a treat, and the original version is a masterpiece, and the new version is a treat. We'll call it that. We move on to the next song. We get Green Fingers, and the contrast between Isabel's dance and Green Fingers might be a little bit too much, because Green Fingers is very much in that In a Foreign Town vibe, where we're very sequenced, very intense drums, and again it's kind of Hammill creating a band out of a solo situation. Although I believe we do get I think we have John Ellis as well as Nick Potter on this track to kind of fill it out. But this is when I first heard the album, I was quite fond of Green Fingers. It's kind of fallen down a little bit for me. It is a little bit clunky, like I said, musically. It's the contrast is just too much. And lyrically, it's I like the lyrical concept. It's a relationship song, but I think it's talking about, in order to get the most out of your relationship, you have to be prepared to go into some difficult places, and that's how the garden blooms, as he says. But it's got some good some good dramatic moments, and it does have a great vocal performance. So it's got its merits, but not one of my favorites on the album. Now, as we move on to track 7, this is where the album gets very, very intense, very, very shortly. Up until this point, for the most part, the songs, with a couple exceptions, it seems like a fairly fun album. Obviously, our Oyster is pretty intense, but it's one of those fun, exploratory albums. But the last 2 songs on this are emotionally draining. They're very, very intense, and both very, very good. So on the surface, this is another one of the very experimental pieces, and he's kind of, in Hamill's own words, it's like there's a riff that's put through a kaleidoscope, and different elements of the riff are given different sound sources, and it kind of creates this. Kaleidoscope is probably the best word for it. It's 8 minutes long, and I don't think it ever repeats itself exactly the same, but it's very, very menacing, very brooding, very uncomfortable to listen to. It doesn't feel like 8 minutes, though. It's a long song, but it doesn't feel that way because you just kind of get sucked into it. And we're on the topic of consciousness again, one of the classic Hammill topics. And just that blurry line between, what you're, what's on the surface, what you're able to interpret when you're awake, and then what's deeper down in the confines of the mind. And I think it's a very, very successful song. I'm a huge fan of On the Surface, and yeah, very, very good, very experimental, very dark, and it's probably the best example of him using that sequenced production to create something that does sound kind of organic. It doesn't sound, you can tell that it's programmed, but it doesn't have that feel, if you know what I mean. It's hard to describe, but it's very good. And then we wrap the album up with possibly Hamill's most emotionally draining song, A Way Out. This is another 8-minute piece. This is kind of more of a traditional Hammill epic, I would say. And lyrically, it's talking about one of those very difficult, difficult subject matters that only somebody like Hammill can articulate so well. In this case, it's the loss of I believe it is the loss of a loved one through suicide. I can't think of any other artist that can tackle something as heavy as that and articulate it so succinctly. And yeah, it's this probably, if there's a classic on the album, this one has gotten a lot of live airplay, whatever. He's played it in the sets for a long time. But lyrically, it's very, very simple. But I think that does it is that way to convey like the sheer raw, naked emotion of it. And yeah, it's almost hard to talk about it because it is so intense. It's such a dark thing. It's such a difficult thing. And but my God, does he do a really good job on it? It is a brilliant piece. Probably not one of my. It's not my favorite on the album because it is so draining, and especially after On the Surface. Like I said, it's this kind of fun exploratory album, and then you get to tracks 7 and 8, and by the time you're done, you're just like, whoa, you need a cigarette or something. But yeah, and that wraps up the album, and it signals Hammill's drive into the '90s. And yeah, of course, after this, he would finally complete the big opera, The Fall of the House of Usher. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about that one. I've heard bits and pieces of it. I don't know it well enough. I don't want to be like the kind of person. I don't want to talk about something that I'm not qualified to talk about. That's one that I've seen it for sale, but it's usually a little bit too expensive. If this is one that gets reissued, I'll buy it in a heartbeat and I'll listen to it and I'll put a chat about it. But the next album I'm going to talk about on this playlist will be Fire Ships, and I'm going to do a video just on Fire Ships because that is a very special album to me. And yeah, we'll talk about more of that later on. But yeah, I guess I'll just say a couple of quick extra notes on the new recordings here. Like I said, I really respect the fact the new recordings of In a Foreign Town and Out of Water. Obviously, if you didn't see me holding this album, I do respect the fact that even though it is completely re-recorded, he keeps a lot of those production choices intact, and he could have completely like redone all the songs and done it the way that he would recorded these songs now, but it wouldn't be doing justice to this period in his career. And I like that it still has those big drums, it still has those synthy lines. The most notable thing is that the songs just breathe a lot more because it's not like so rigid and to the grid. The arrangements just they feel a little considerably more alive. It's very interesting, obviously, hearing the older Hammill voice tackling some of these songs I already mentioned. It's great hearing him say, "Get back in the motor." And yeah, I guess for the most part, the songs are very true to the originals. I think the two biggest changes would be something about Isabel's Dance, which has a whole new section to it, which I mentioned earlier, and also No Moon in the Water, because I don't think he was able to recreate those that particular madness that he did originally in 1990. But I think I prefer the new version of No Moon in the Water. Again, it's a little bit more slippery and mysterious, I guess. So yeah, like I said, if you're a Hammill fan and you're open to this particular era, you got to pick this up. It's really cool that he put this together, and I'm certainly glad that he did because they're underappreciated albums. I think all of Hammill's albums are underappreciated, obviously, but even more so with these two. So if you're a fan, pick it up. It's worth it. And yeah, I think that's just about it. This video is probably ridiculously long now. I had a burst of energy and I'm feeling motivated. So feeling motivated and productive. So I thought to myself, I'm just going to talk about these albums. I haven't listened to them in a little while. I've spent a lot of time listening to the re-recordings not too long ago, but I'm such a big fan. I know the songs pretty darn well, so it's easy enough for me to put together a little video for you. And I'm hopefully the production value is a little bit better. The last couple of videos I did had this stupid cropping because I'm just recording on my phone. I'm not fancy like that. I'm not into video editing. If you've made it this far in the video, please do ask me or answer me. Should I re-record the other Peter Hammill videos? So like from Fool's Mate up to the K Group, because I watched a couple of them, and again the camera I was using for those was just a stupid laptop computer, and it's not in focus. It sounds horrible. So if that bugs you, do you think I should just do those ones again once I finish up until modern Hammill times? Let me know in the comments if you made it this far. as ever, thank you so much for listening, and yeah, you'll see me in the future. Take care.